Have you ever noticed how Europe seems to leap from one crisis to the next, almost as if the continent barely has time to breathe before the next shock hits? There is this constant sense of tension in the background, like everyone is waiting for the next financial tremor. And the truth is, what we're watching today did not appear out of thin air. It is the long aftermath of 6 major economic shocks that reshaped, weakened, and in some cases completely dismantled the foundations of Europe's financial stability. When you start connecting these moments, you begin to see that Europe's economy is not collapsing suddenly. It has been slowly pulled in this direction for decades. Each crisis leaves a scar, and together they reveal a story that is far bigger and far heavier than most people realize. If you are here to understand what is actually pulling Europe into long-term economic decline, and you are tired of surface-level headlines that skip over the real causes, then you are absolutely in the right place. In this video, we are going to walk through 6 major financial crises, step by step, in a way that actually makes sense and feels human, not overly technical or disconnected from real life. You will see how each crisis unfolded, how it affected ordinary people, and how its impact still shapes daily life across Europe today. By the end, you will have a clear picture of the larger forces at work and why they matter for your savings, your career, and the direction of the global economy. Europe's economic story becomes far easier to understand when you walk through these 6 crises in the order they happened, because each one left the continent a little weaker, a little more hesitant, and a little more dependent on decisions made far outside its borders. And the first real turning point came in the 1970s, during the oil shock that caught almost every European nation completely off guard. Imagine waking up and realizing that gas prices have doubled overnight, inflation is running wild, and entire industries are slowing to a crawl or stopping altogether. That was the reality for millions of Europeans. At the time, Europe relied heavily on imported oil, far more than the United States did. So, when major producers cut supply and prices skyrocketed, Europe felt the hit almost instantly. Families struggled with energy bills. Companies faced costs they could not control. Governments scrambled for solutions they did not really have. And even after the initial shock faded, the long-term effects stayed. Stagnant growth, rising unemployment, and a creeping awareness that Europe was far more vulnerable to external pressures than it wanted to admit. It was the beginning of Europe's dependency problem. And even though countries eventually convinced themselves that they had recovered, the truth was that they were simply bracing for the next blow. That next blow arrived in 1992, during one of Europe's most dramatic financial moments, the breakdown of the exchange rate mechanism. To understand that crisis, you only need a simple picture. Think of the ERM as Europe trying to keep its currencies walking in a straight line together. But some economies were jogging, others were limping, and a few were stopping for every 20 minutes. Trying to force them into perfect alignment created pressure that was impossible to sustain. And into that pressure stepped global currency speculators, none more famous than George Soros, whose short bet against the British pound became legendary. When he bet that the pound was overvalued and that the United Kingdom could not keep it aligned inside the ERM, he was right. The system cracked almost immediately. The Bank of England spent billions trying to defend the currency, but the market pressure was far greater. European governments felt a mix of embarrassment and panic, because the entire experiment was supposed to show how united and disciplined Europe could be. Instead, it revealed deep economic differences and early structural cracks long before the euro even existed. But instead of slowing down, Europe pushed forward. Leaders still believed a single currency could lead to a stronger future. And that determination, for better or worse, carried the continent straight into the crisis almost everyone remembers. The 2008 global financial meltdown felt different because it was not just an economic event. It was an emotional one. Whether you were in school, working your first job, paying off a mortgage, or running a business, everyone felt the impact of 2008. The crisis started with the collapse of the US housing market, but the shockwaves reached Europe fast, exposing deeper structural weaknesses that had been ignored for years. Banks across the continent froze. Companies stopped hiring. Growth turned negative almost everywhere. Governments rushed in with bailout programs that were massive in scale and hugely controversial in the public eyes. And beneath the numbers, something far more important happened. Millions of people lost trust in the financial system, and that distrust has shaped European politics, voting patterns, and public debates ever since. Many Europeans still carry the emotional memory of that year, the fear of losing a job, the anxiety of watching savings shrink, and the sense that the system that was supposed to protect ordinary people had failed them. But if 2008 cracked Europe's economic foundation, the next crisis would completely shatter it. The Eurozone debt crisis of the early 2010s was the moment when Europe learned how difficult it is to share a currency without sharing financial habits, economic cultures, or growth trajectories. The simplest way to understand the dilemma is this: different countries were using one currency, but they lived in completely different economic realities. As a result, when debts piled up, interest rates spiked, and investors lost confidence, some countries were hit dramatically harder. Greece came close to defaulting. Portugal and Spain saw unemployment jump to levels not seen in generations. Governments introduced severe austerity programs that cut public spending deeply, and these decisions reshaped daily life. For millions of families, this was not a macroeconomic debate happening on television. It was losing jobs, delaying important life decisions, struggling to keep homes, and feeling the ground shift beneath their feet. Even as Europe worked to stabilize the crisis, the political cost was enormous. The years that followed saw a rise in political polarization, distrust in the European Union, and a long-lasting sense that solidarity across Europe had limits. And when the continent finally started gathering the pieces together again, something completely unexpected happened. In early 2020, Europe experienced what felt like a sudden stop. Empty streets, closed borders, planes grounded, entire countries shutting down one by one. It felt like the world froze in real time. The pandemic hit Europe particularly hard because its economy depends heavily on services, travel, tourism, and close personal interactions. Restaurants, airports, hotels, and small businesses all suffered catastrophic losses. Governments introduced enormous stimulus packages to keep people afloat, but that spending pushed national debts to historic highs. At the same time, global supply chains broke down. Items that once arrived in predictable cycles suddenly took months. Manufacturers struggled to get key parts. Shipping routes stalled. Even today, several of those supply chain problems have not fully been resolved. But beyond the economic numbers, the emotional impact was profound. This crisis changed how Europeans work, how they travel, how they shop, and how they think about stability. It forced entire societies to rethink their priorities, and many of those shifts still influence the economy today. Yet, just as the pandemic began to fade and Europe tried to breathe again, another shockwave hit with full force. The energy shock of 2020 became one of the most urgent and destabilizing crises the continent had faced in decades. When Russia invaded Ukraine, European energy flows were disrupted almost instantly. After years of relying on Russian gas, Europe suddenly found itself scrambling for alternatives. What had been a long-term vulnerability turned into an immediate emergency. Prices soared across the continent. Some factories had to shut down because they could not afford the energy needed to operate. Inflation returned with a level of intensity that Europe had not seen in decades. And behind closed doors, European leaders expressed real fear about whether the continent had enough energy to get through winter without blackouts. It was the first time in a generation that energy security became a central political and economic anxiety. And once again, Europe was forced to rethink its entire strategy, this time while under immense pressure and rising costs. When you step back and look at these 6 crises as a whole, a pattern becomes painfully clear. Each one weakened Europe a little more. Each one added new problems without fully resolving the old ones. By the time the continent reached the 2020s, it was carrying a mountain of structural challenges, an aging population, slower innovation compared to global competitors, rising public debt, and political fragmentation that made big decisions more difficult. It is like watching someone take hit after hit. One punch does not knock them out, but 6. Eventually, the body stops bouncing back. Europe's economy has been dragged into fragility not by one single disaster, but by a sequence of shocks that stacked on top of each other, each creating deeper vulnerabilities and longer-term consequences. And now, as the continent looks toward the future, the weight of these crises still shapes every major decision, every debate, and every attempt at rebuilding confidence. Europe is not collapsing overnight, and it is not experiencing a sudden breakdown. It is carrying the weight of decades of unresolved crises, each one leaving behind a bruise that never fully healed. When we step back and look at these 6 pivotal moments together, we begin to understand not only where Europe stands today, but also the direction it may be moving toward in the years ahead. If this breakdown helped you see the broader picture a little more clearly, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I would genuinely love to hear what resonated with you the most and what questions you want to explore next.